And you'll find out why pretty soon. This is a class about the matter of France. The mythologies of the Middle Ages. There were three primary mythologies that people in the, let's say, from the High to Renaissance, High Middle Ages to the Renaissance, that preoccupied their minds. There were three: the matter of Rome, the matter of Britain, the matter of France. We think of other mythologies, like we have the Norse mythology, but that had been largely lost to the people of the Middle Ages by, let's say, the High Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages, there were some remnants still. Although in the early Middle Ages, by the time of the Crusades, the Scandinavian countries had been Christianized for several hundred years. So that had already been mostly lost, but definitely by the High Middle Ages. And the three mythologies were, first, the matter of Rome. The matter of Rome is it is a combination of the historic lives of the classical world. So Caesar, Alexander the Great, Pyrrhus of Macedon, Pyrrhus of Epirus. Those, like Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, they knew about those things and they romanticized or heroicized the lives of those individuals. But also, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, all of those were wrapped up into the same mythologized history. And also, Jason and the Argonauts, Hercules, Perseus, Bellerophon, all of those were, you can think of it somewhat like how Herodotus looked at history. He took all of the mythology and said, well, okay, let's just omit the workings of the gods, and all of those things happened, and that's history. So the mind of the Middle Ages was very similar. They took all of the mythology and all of the history and wrapped it in one. And it didn't matter if something was magical because they lived in a magical world. It was not apparent to them that the world was entirely mundane. In fact, it's not apparent to all of us sometimes that the world is entirely mundane. So they had no problem making the leap from Caesar's conquest of Gaul to the killing spree of Achilles choking a river god. That's no big deal. So that was the matter of Rome. The matter of Britain we're all familiar with, and that's the only matter that we still refer to by name. That is the Arthurian legend, the legend that surrounded Arthur, his court, his immediate predecessors, and immediate successors. We are fairly certain now that that was a historical time, that shortly after the collapse of the Roman Empire, first the withdrawal of Rome from Britain, and then the collapse of the Roman Empire in Gaul and the retreat back to Rome, there was a revival in Britain around that time. That there was a romanticized Celt who had a revivified kingdom, and they reached across the sea only to find that they were all alone. And those exploits grew into the legend of King Arthur, and when the French got a hold of it, they added Lancelot. But it doesn't matter, history was, because it didn't matter to them. What happened, and this did not happen so much in the matter of Rome. In the matter of Rome, there was the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Romance of Alexander. Those characters, the characters in those epics, and Alexander the Great, made up the primary figures of the matter of Rome. So the matter of Rome never became novelized, I guess. The individuals were not treated as characters, I guess you could say. Yes. Whereas if you took a look at Arthurian history, you could write a new novel about Lancelot, and it would be accepted. Could you write a new novel about Julius Caesar and how he went off to Africa and fell in love and married an Egyptian? Like, huh? But that happened in the matter of Britain. So Lancelot's escapade, where he lost his mind and then he fell in love with Elaine and had a child with her and then recovered his senses and then went back to court as if nothing ever happened. Like, that can happen in a chivalric romance. It was harder to do that with the matter of Rome. So that's the matter of Britain. We know the matter of Britain. Then the matter of France. The matter of France is the mythology that developed around the court of Charlemagne, and it was started off by unlike the matter of Britain or the matter of Rome, where there were multiple sources. We know the starting point for the matter of France, and that is the Song of Roland. The Song of Roland establishes the characters, not all of them, but the primary characters, and we can watch so clearly in the matter of France how the mythology developed. That's the second page. There was an initial heroicized history. These were called the chansons de geste, the songs of greatness or the songs of bravery. And that is what the Song of Roland is. It is actually a song. It is written in meter. It is written in rhyming meter, mostly rhyming meter. And it was sung. And every once in a while it is still sung in France. The French is archaic by today's standards, but it's still understandable to a native French speaker. If, like, you try to run it through Google Translate, that will not work at all. I know, I tried. Actually, when you recite not usually the Song of Roland in its entirety, because it's big, it's long, but if you recite sections of it, it is customary in France still today to say, like, when the recitation is done, you say "Merci Roland," like, thank you, Roland, for what you've done for France. So the initial heroicized histories were things that very likely actually happened. And actually we have some echoes of those in today's SCA, where we have retellings and sometimes retellings in song of great deeds that have happened in the society. Then, about 300 years subsequent to those events, as the culture of chivalry really takes hold in France, at the same time, the chivalric literature, the chivalric romance, came into its own. And the romance is a weird art form. On the one hand, there are epic deeds. It's very, very tempting to look at the chivalric romances and the earlier heroic epics and say that they're the same thing, but they're not. There is an element of aspirational heroicism in chivalric romances, but there is also almost always a supernatural element, and almost always an element of love interest that was absent in the heroic epics. But the more I look at chivalric romances, the more I feel that they were like an aspirational longing of the chivalric class, because they were constrained by reality just like we are. And while they were knights that we aspire to today, they also aspired to the earlier times where men were more free to do brave deeds. And so that's what a lot of the romances, what the romances put on the page were the aspirations that they had in their hearts. Wouldn't it be great if I could find a mystical sword like Durandal, and a sword that could not be broken, so I could slay 100 men and gain all of that glory? And what could I do with glory like that? What could my life be like? They also, I believe, were often subtly social criticisms. We'll get into that a little later when we talk about Charlemagne and how he was depicted. And then, that was that time in history, and as you get to about the 15th century, you see the development of the proto-novel, which became true novels by the 16th century. And that the unusual... the chivalric romances are almost twisted from our perspective. It's strange. There's this element of strangeness that just doesn't fit to our minds. And it didn't fit with the minds of the people in the Renaissance either, because there's a definite change in the tone and the structure of the stories. The adventures that they wrote, they were still preoccupied with characters, but the adventures that they wrote were much more, familiar to us. Like, it would work to take a 16th century novel about the matter of France and translate it into a movie. Maybe not directly, but the story structure is the same. And by that time, there was no relation to the initial heroicized history. It didn't matter. These people were characters. They weren't real. Okay? So, the best way to understand the matter of France, but also the matter of Britain, and the way that people thought and related to this content, is Marvel versus DC. It really is. The matter of Britain, that's the DCU. The matter of France, that's the MCU, and the matter of Rome is Star Wars. Okay, that's how they related to these characters. And so the characters, the initial people, became much like our pantheon of superheroes, and that's how they related to those characters. And so you would get, in history, people arguing about who was the greater knight the same way that they argue about who was the stronger superhero. Can Thor beat Iron Man? Could Thor beat Superman? Can anybody beat Superman? And well, that was how they related to the characters. And sometimes you've got crossovers. Now, the events that made the matter of Britain happen probably around maybe 450 AD, somewhere in the 5th century. The events of Charlemagne's reign were at the end of the 8th century. Charlemagne, I believe, was crowned emperor in 800 AD and died 3 or 5 years thereafter, which is not how it happens in the legends. He becomes emperor and then becomes the conquering emperor, whereas before he had been a king and then conquered. Charlemagne, the man, was a conquering warlord. He had a great deal of family. He accumulated his family by every time he conquered a local people, he took the princess as his wife, or a concubine. He had, I believe, 7 wives that we know of and 13 concubines, named ones that we know of. He had children off of many of them, but he also lived such a long life that the only legitimate child of his who survived him was Louis. Louis the Pious? Might have been. I think it was Louis the Pious. That doesn't show up in the matter of France. There, he is the Christian Alexander. He is the conquering king and the defender of the faith. Those two go hand in hand, as they really did in history at the same time. Charlemagne always, no, almost always fights the Saracen, fights the Muslim. The historic Charlemagne primarily fought against the German heathens. Like the story of the Great Heathen Lord was against Charlemagne. Wittikind was historic Charlemagne's primary adversary. Those stories are almost all lost, changed into. You can see in the text there were times where the mode of the story would be well suited to a European pagan adversary, but they were changed into Saracens because those were the villains of the day. And that happens a lot. There's the story of King Horn, which was a Middle English proto-novel. It was very clearly about a young noble who was dispossessed from his land by Vikings and was carried away on a little tub, almost like Moses, and the obvious Vikings came in on ships and they were raiding the land of Westerness, I think. But in the story that exists to us today, they were all Saracens. Like, where are they? Okay, the Saracens came in on long ships, did they? Sure. Although we can't discount that too much because during especially the early and even into high Middle Ages, there were naval raids by the Muslim world into Christian Europe all over the place. Paris was sacked. Rome was sacked. And those things exist in the Carolingian legend. Usually it's backdrops, but they exist. And so it's like, wow, it's fascinating to see the history, bits of reality that still are in the legends. But what I want to do is go over the characters so you have an idea of who these people are, and give you just a couple of the legends about them, so that the tapestry of legend can begin to make sense. Because I ran into this cold. I started translating a German proto-novel, and I had no idea who these people were because their names change. Their names change a lot. I had no idea that König Karl was Charlemagne. I had no idea. We'll get into that later. But Charlemagne is the Anglicization of the Charlemagne's name in French. We just borrow that. But in his life, he was Karl. He was King Karl. King Karl Magnus. Carolus Magnus, if you were Latinizing it. You can see how we got Charlemagne. But in the Scandinavian countries, he was Karl Magnus. And Magnus became a name in Scandinavian countries because of Charlemagne. They look like Karl and Magnus. That looks like two good names, so Magnus is a perfectly good name. There's a Just So story about how Charlemagne got two first names coming to us from Scandinavia, because it wasn't an issue anywhere else, but in Scandinavia where Magnus was a name, we're like, well, why does he have two first names? And they thought the etymology was Magnus being Magenhus, which in Swedish is powerhouse. So it's like, all right, yeah, the greatest Christian king, Karl Powerhouse. Yeah, sure. But like, how did you get two first names? And so the story was when Charlemagne was a young man and his father died, and he was to inherit the kingship. An angel came to him in his sleep and says, "Flee Paris," because of course he lived in Paris. Flee Paris and go to the Ardennes, the Great Forest, and find Basin the thief and become a thief. And he's like, really? So a little perturbed by this angelic message, he goes to the archbishop and says, I had this vision. Why? And the archbishop says, well, probably there's a plot against your life. And as for becoming a thief, only God can know, but follow his commands. And so he goes to the Ardennes, and he finds this thief, Basin, who is kind of a clever man, a cunning man, who seemed to have arts about him, which he's not a straight-out sorcerer as other characters will be later on in the legend, but he was a cunning man. He could make himself invisible, basically. And so he's like, all right, fine, I guess by royal command, I'll teach you how to be a thief. And so one of the first marks is this house of a nobleman. And Basin the thief goes in and he robs the place. And he comes out and he's like, okay, that was pretty good, let's go. And Charlemagne says, well, my turn. I want to go. And Basin the thief is like, oh, okay. So, young Charlemagne goes and faces the place, and he winds up in the bedroom of the noble, and he sees a sword, and so he's like, okay, that's a good thing to steal, so he takes the sword, but then the noble and his wife come back, and they're going to enter the bedroom, so Charlemagne dives under the bed. While he's there, the nobleman is boasting to his wife that he's going to be the king. Really? So Charlemagne is just, this is very interesting information. And the noble has plotted with 13 other nobles that they've all purchased black daggers, and they're going to stab the king to death on the day of his coronation, just like Caesar. And the wife says, I don't think that doesn't seem righteous. You are only noble because this man's father has made you what you are, and you're going to repay him for all the good you've gotten by murdering his son. That seems sketchy. And he says, shut up, woman. Backhands her across the face. She falls onto the bed, and her nose is bleeding. And Charlemagne grabs a glove and catches some of the blood as it falls from her face. And then they leave and do something else. He gets out of there, and then he's like, I'm taking this guy's horse. So he steals his horse too. Goes back to Basin, and he's like, alright, the sword and the horse, that's some evidence. I think this is a pretty good day. And Bason's like, yeah, I guess so. Good day. Well, Charlemagne goes, and then he goes back to his mother and the archbishop who gave him the advice, and says, all right, I found a plot against me. I think that's what the angel is telling me to do. Well, what do we do now? And so the archbishop says, well, there's another archbishop, and we can get him, because he's a younger man, and carries a sword after the example of St. Peter, and this will become Archbishop Turpin. And then there's the Duke of Bavaria has a son who's a very clever man. His name is, oh my god, Nemo. Sometimes he is Duke Nemo, which I thought was awesome, but that is one of the less used names. If you look for him, he will be Naaman usually. But get him, and he'll bring a couple thousand men, and roll right up the Pope, and ask for a couple thousand men from Rome, and we'll bring everybody together for the coronation, and we'll divvy up the traitors' men in between everybody, so there won't be enough critical mass to have a revolution. Okay, great. So that's what they do. And they gather all of the nobles together to swear fealty after the coronation, and then Charlemagne's men leap on to the traitors. They pull back their sleeves, and they see the black daggers strapped to their forearms. And they say, aha, traitor, you are exposed. But the evil traitor says, well, we're armed. We're allowed to bear arms. We're noble. There's no crime in having all the same dagger. We're sworn brothers. That's our symbol. And Charlemagne grabs the sword and the glove and says, "Do you recognize your sword? Do you recognize this glove? This is the blood of your wife. When you struck her for speaking against your evil plot." And the noble was outraged and he said, "You're a thief. You're nothing but a thief. A thief can never be king." Charlemagne says, "Well, no, that was my alter ego. I had an alter ego at the time. I was not Carl then. I was Magnus." And Archbishop Kirkman said, "Well, you know, if you were Magnus at the time, because you can't be a thief, you can't be king, that disqualifies you from kingship. So you probably ought to be baptized as Magnus, so that your actions then were not those of a thief, but were actually those of a king investigating to give justice. Because a king can appropriate his subjects' goods in the pursuit of justice. So he was baptized as Magnus. That's why Charlemagne has two first names." You're like, okay, that was a good story, but at the same time, that's like, all right, I see what you're doing. You're telling a just so story. So Charlemagne in legend is portrayed always in three ways. Sometimes he is the protagonist, much as he was in that one. Sometimes he is a quest giver. He has a problem. He goes to a knight and gives them the opportunity to resolve the problem and build renown for themselves. And at other times, he is the tyrant. He is either because of anger or being misinformed, he is unjust to young knights, and they have to contend with his injustice and eventually resolve themselves with it to restore order. Like if you fight the king for long enough, you're not serving justice anymore because he is the king. So you have to come to some kind of negotiated resolution to remove the injustice, but also still submit to the authority of the king. Alright, the next, these are pretty much in order of importance. The next central figure of mythology is Roland. Roland was very likely a historical person. It was Count Rudland, who, actually we don't know he's a count at all. He's just Rudland. Roland is a count. Rudland was known as a good fighter. He is the Christian Achilles. If you know anything about the Iliad, Achilles was not, let's say, someone to emulate. You might want to emulate his prowess, but maybe not his personality. Roland is the same way. He embodies all of the virtues and vices of chivalry. So, if you are Roland's friend, Roland will bend over backwards to give you the shirt off his back and do anything for you. If you are Roland's enemy, or even somebody he doesn't like, he will not spare a kind word at all. He will tear a strip off your hide, even if doing so could start a war. And in fact, he'd be happier if it did. He will ride straight at anybody, including verbally, to his detriment. He carries the magic sword Durandal. And Durandal has a couple of origins. The one in the Song of Roland is it was brought down by angels. It has like a tooth of St. Peter, a fragment of the cloak of St. Denis, patron saint of France, a drop of the blood of the Virgin Mary, and like it's angelic. That's one. Another is that Durandal and Almace and Cortana, but not Joyous for some reason. Almace with the sword of Archbishop Turpin, Cortana with the sword of Olgradonsky. You'll get to them later. These three magic swords were all given by a Jewish arms merchant. There was the legend, it's not specifically Jewish, but his name is Mordecai, his brother is Abraham. So Mordecai goes to Charlemagne and says, my brother has been falsely imprisoned, and I can't do anything because I'm a merchant, but you are a knight, and if you rescue him, I just happen to have these fantastic swords, so I can't do anything with these, but you can. And so Charlemagne rescues Abraham, and he gets these three fantastic swords. So, where did Durandal come from? We don't know. I like the Jewish arms merchant story, it just tickles me. But Durandal's thing is it cannot be broken. Not necessarily that it cuts anything, but it can't be broken. That's its thing. He carries the magic horn Olifant. And Olifant cannot help but be heard in me. That's its thing. That's its magic. It's very simple, direct magic. It has one thing, but it always does that thing. And Roland is the last to die at Rochefort Pass, because Roland is Achilles. He cannot be killed by mortal means. No enemy could overcome Roland. Only Roland could overcome Roland. So in the story of... let's talk about the Song of Roland. Roland's thing, in reality, the Spanish campaign that Charlemagne enacted, he did when he was 30. Yes, Rochefort Pass was his only military defeat, but that happened when he was 30, and then he went on to do everything else in Europe. He conquered all of Germany, he exterminated the Avars as a culture group. All of that happened afterwards, but in mythology, this is the end. So Charlemagne is an old man. The first generation of heroes that accompany him are all old. Roland is, in the flower of his life. He's an adult. He's not a youth anymore. So the idea is that the Muslims and the Christians have been fighting around the Pyrenees for a long time, but everybody's fine with the status quo, except that the Sultan of Babylon is assembling a monstrous heathen army to march through Africa and up into Spain to then conquer Europe. And the Spanish Muslim lords are not happy about having the very distant Putin very present on their neck. And so they sent a message to Charlemagne and said, look, we know that you want us to be Christian. We don't want to be ruled by the Sultan of Babylon directly, so you come down here, you take our oaths, you'll be our liege lord, we'll convert to Christianity, and this will all be part of the empire. We'll keep the foreigners out. We'll keep it between us. Everybody says, great! So, they go to Spain. Unfortunately, the Sultan of Babylon is already there with the army, and so all of the Spanish Muslims are like, heels off, cut it out. We can't do this anymore. And the Christians are upset until they're like, fine, I guess war it is. And so they besiege many castles and towns and raids. There are many battles. They fight for 7 years. And the city of Saragossa is the jewel of Spain, and they are sieging Saragossa, and they're about to break it open. So, the Lord of Saragossa says, all right, we'll go back to the deal. We'll give up. We want to quit. So we'll convert to Christianity. That's fine. Just let's have an end to it and call off the war. Everybody is happy with this idea, except Roland. Roland says, we got him on the ropes. We're about to win. You don't take the deal when you're about to win. You make them take your deal when we're about to win.
Let's go in there, kick all their asses, kill all these traitorous dogs who lied to us, take what we want, buy our own swords, and then we can talk about a deal with anybody who's left over. Roland is shouted down, mostly by his father-in-law. No, stepfather, excuse me, stepfather. Roland has always hated his stepfather, Ganelon. Ganelon was a successful and powerful warlord in his own right. He is a duke. He is the brother-in-law of Charlemagne. But he wasn't Roland's natural father, and so Roland always resented him, and they've been at loggerheads forever. Ganelon says quite reasonably, we are exhausted, we've had enough of this war, the only person who wants to keep killing is you, so why don't you sit down and shut up, and the rest of us adults will deal with other adults. So Roland stews on it for a while, and they agree to take the Spaniards up on the deal. But they also aren't happy with the war being caused by a lie, so they demand that the Lord of Saragossa submit to be beheaded while everybody else converts to Christianity. Okay, that's settled. Now, who's going to go tell the Lord of Saragossa the terms? Archbishop Turpin says, I'll go. And Charlemagne is like, you are a man of the cloth? Forget the message. They'll kill you for being a priest. No. Duke Naiman says, I'll go. And everyone's like, no, you are our wise Nestor. You can't go. You're too valuable to lose. We need your wisdom. Roland pipes up and says, how about Ganelon? It's your idea. You go tell him. Ganelon is furious because whoever goes is probably going to die. Because even if they take the terms, the Lord of Saragossa is not going to accept the insult of having his head demanded, even if his retainers are like, yeah, we'll do it, whether he likes it or not. So, Ganelon says, all right, I'll go. You remember this. So he goes to Saragossa, and he, even in the Song of Roland, he says, as long as I have my sword, I will fear nothing. Because even if they kill me, I can fight back. Only if they disarm me will I be afraid. So he's still a brave man, but he's going to be a traitor. So he tells the king of Saragossa what the deal is. And he's like, all right, you've heard the deal. Now here's my deal. Present them with someone else's head. They don't know what your face is. I'll bring it back and say that they beheaded you. You send your men out to become baptized. Whether it's true or not, that's up to your conscience, not mine. You give the ransom that you said that you were going to give. When Charlemagne withdraws with his army, I'll make sure that the little shit who made sure that this was the deal is in the rear guard. You fall upon that rear guard and you annihilate it entirely. And so the king of Saragossa says, that's a pretty good deal. So that's exactly what happens. They send some random guy's head. They put a crown on the beheaded head. The disembodied head. And he presents it to Charlemagne and says, this is the king of Saragossa. These men have been baptized and have sworn to the cross. They've fulfilled their terms. Here's the treasure. Let's go. So they do. And they're determining order of march. And Ganelon says, just in case, we probably ought to have our strongest knights in the back. That seems reasonable to everyone, even Roland. And so that's their order of march. And then as the army passes through Rochefort Pass, which translated means Bramblethorn Pass, No, Bramblethorn Valley. Bramblethorn Valley. Lanche is the brambles, and the Vaux is the valley. So they're passing through Bramble Valley, and the rear third of the army is fallen upon by an army of like 100,000 or something like that. Just preposterous numbers. In reality, they were the French Basques. French-Spanish Basques. They were Basques. Were they Muslim? Yes. Were they also Christian? Yes. They were Basque first. The Basques played, this is not part of the legend, sorry, but this is reality. The Basques played both sides off of each other. On the north side of the Pyrenees, the Basques were like, we're all Christians. Or, like, I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, they're all Christians back there. So, we're all friends here. On the south side of the Pyrenees, the Basques were like, I'm Muslim, you're Muslim, I'm Muslim, they're all Muslim up there. Just leave us alone to be Muslims. And there was actually, this is almost unthinkable today, but at the time, especially in more liminal areas, it was not really accepted, but it was accepted that it happened, that people would go through a life cycle changing religions. Like, if there were pagans around, you might start off your life as a young man as a pagan, because then you can win money and glory and honor by the edge of the sword, and your religion wasn't telling you any different. That was perfectly acceptable. And then when you were already successful, then maybe you switch over to being Muslim and you take a bunch of wives, because that's acceptable. And then, after you're towards the end of your life, you find the idea of salvation compelling, and you've already had your fun, you convert to Christianity towards the end of your life. And then you have all of your sins forgiven, and you go to heaven.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly! Right! So you have your cake for a while, and then at the end of your life, you eat it. And so it was accepted that was done. So it was not so outre that Basques would kind of have a life cycle of shifting religions. But neither side liked that. Anyway, so yes, it was the Basques who attacked Charlemagne and gave him his only defeat. But in the story, it's the Muslims, because it probably was Muslim Basques doing it. And so they fall upon the French knights, and they fight bravely, and they slay many of the Muslims. And the 12 peers of France... The 12 peers of France are an anomalous collection of people who are named in the Song of Roland, but are named, or those people never show up anywhere else. And the 12 peers of France are supposed to be the greatest French knights. So, the 12 peers of France are like a catch-all, kind of like saying the Knights of the Round Table. It's like, the Knights of the Round Table were at this battle. And this person, this person, this person, and this person all died, but that doesn't mean that the Knights of the Round Table are all gone. So the 12 peers of France were in the Song of Roland, and they all died, but after that, there will be a new 12 peers of France. And this is the origin of the mythology of the Paladin, because the 12 peers of France, all of these brave knights, were said to be the pillars on which the Reich rested, and they were like the Palatine hills surrounding Rome held up Rome. And so these knights, the peers of France, were called the Palatines, and that became Paladin. So that's where Paladin comes from. It comes from the matter of France. And Roland was the first Paladin. Also, Archbishop Turpin is probably a Paladin, which is probably why we get the association with holiness. Anyway, so they fight and fight and fight and fight, and everybody dies. Mostly. Roland cannot be killed by mortal men. And so he is struck senseless, but he's not dead. And then his friend, Oliver. Oliver is the Christian Patroclus. Oliver is Roland's best friend. He's been his best friend forever. There are stories about how they meet. There's a beautiful story about how Oliver's grandfather and Charlemagne were at odds, and eventually, after a siege, I think Oliver was from Orleans. I think that was his city. And after a siege of Orleans, they agreed to send out 2 youths to fight it out. And young Roland and young Oliver go, and they're in full armor. They can't see each other. They fight and fight and fight and fight, and eventually they knock each other's helmets from their head. And Oliver says, "I forfeit," and Roland throws his sword to the side and says, "I yield me," and they embrace as friends. And so the old men are like, "Well, shit, I guess we have to make peace." So that's Oliver. Oliver is the best friend. However, Oliver will always be shown up by Roland. And so while in the Song of Roland, like, Oliver was probably a real person. Oliver and Roland were probably real friends. Oliver, like Patroclus, is a doughty warrior in his own right, but he's not a superhuman. And so, sorry, I'm talking ahead. As later myths go on, they're like, well, that can't be the end, there must be more. But you already know what the end is for Oliver, and he's not as awesome as Roland. And so by the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance, they don't like Oliver anymore, so they replace him with other cooler knights. It's like Jimmy Olsen. Like, Superman's best friend is Jimmy Olsen. Really? No. Superman can't be best friends with a nerdy reporter kid. What the heck? No, Superman's best friend is Batman. And that's exactly what they did in the Legends. That's exactly what they did. They're like, well, I mean, Oliver's okay, but his best friend's got to be Reinhold, right? Reinhold does not show up in the Song of Roland. Reinhold is not here. We don't know why Reinhold is not here in legend, but Reinhold's not here. So anyway, Oliver and Archbishop Turpin are pulling knights out of the way. They back themselves into a crevasse where 2 can hold off many. Oliver eventually falls. Roland wakes up and is slaying pagans one after the other, and eventually he falls, faints of exhaustion, and there's almost no one left on the battlefield. And Archbishop Turpin, there's a beautiful passage where he goes down to a rivulet of water falling off the rock and uses his helmet to gather water, and he baptizes Roland. It's not really a baptism, but it is as if it is a baptism, where the water is refreshing him, and that act is his last, and he falls dead of exhaustion in his accumulated wounds. And Roland wakes up on the battlefield alone. Everyone's dead. They're all gone. Archbishop Turpin has succeeded in giving last rites to everyone else, and Roland is gravely wounded, but he's still up and around, and he doesn't know what to do except to blow the horn Oliphant. And Oliver had been saying, "Blow the horn, Roland," and Roland's like, "No pagan will ever make me blow the horn." And so everybody's dead, and it's true that no pagan ever did make him blow the horn, but now everybody's dead. And so he blows the horn to summon Charlemagne. And he blows once, and in the far distance, Charlemagne turns and says, "Did you hear something?" And Gamelon says no. And he blows again, louder, and says, "I think I heard something." Gamelon says, "No, I think you're imagining things." And Roland blows one last blast, so strong that he ruptures something inside himself. And the sound can be heard all as far as Paris, because That's Oliphant's magic. It glows so hard that he ruptures his internal organs and he dies from the injuries that he caused himself. And the last blast of Oliphant rings out, and Charlemagne looks at Ganelon and says, "What did you do?" So they turn the army around and they find the tremendous battlefield. And Roland has taken Durandal and jammed it into a rock so that he tried to break it, but Durandal can't break. That's his thing. So failing to destroy it so that it can't be used by naked hands, he jams it into a rock where it can't be withdrawn by any hands. And Charlemagne weeps over his nephew. And then they say to Ganelon, "You did this. We're going to get you, you son of a bitch." And he says, "Well, can you?" Because I'll admit, I coordinated with the Muslims to kill Roland. But that was in revenge, and that was a private matter. Because he tried to kill me by sending me off to be killed by the Muslims. So I sent the Muslims to kill him. Fair is fair. I didn't betray you. I didn't betray France. I'm still within my rights. And Charlemagne's older generation, like Ogier the Dane, was one of Charlemagne's better friends. One of his first enemies turned allies. And said, "I'll fight him." "No, you have to be a judge. You're too senior." And so the only person who will take up the king's sword and fight Ganelon's champion is a young knight who has no business doing this. But he does, and he is being beaten very badly. But God will not allow injustice to stand, and so he strengthens the hand of the virtuous young knight who defeats the far more powerful but unvirtuous older knight. And so, because Ganelon's lost the trial of arms, he's torn between horses and he's torn into pieces, and his body is burned and buried in several different places, and his head is placed on a pike above the cathedral at Aachen, which was the capital. And and that's the song of Roland. And everybody's like, "Merci Roland!" That's an interesting end to the story. That is not the thematic ending that we would choose today. But that is something that gives it some verisimilitude, which indicates that it might have actually happened, and it's just been heroicized. But yes, this is Ganelon. If you are familiar with the Legend of Zelda, you will recognize Ganon. Ganon was modeled after Ganelon. The names were similar enough that when it came time to turn Ganon into a human villain rather than a pig orc demon that he was in the original Legend of Zelda, Ganelon. Okay, what did Ganelon look like? Well, he was a powerful warrior who was older and he had a red beard. So, yes, Ganelon was actually based on Archbishop Wenlo, but in later fiction, they're like, well, he betrayed Charlemagne, so he's nothing but a traitor. So they're in later stories, they're like, well, you can't ever have him be good. He's always got to be the villain, because he's the villain in the end. So he can't be good. You can't make him cool. He's got to be the villain. So Ganelon became a stock character. In fact, almost all of the figures in Carolingian Legend became stock characters. How are we doing on time? Oh, okay. All right. We'll just go through a couple of these. Reinhold became Charlemagne's best friend. Reinhold in the Four Sons of Aemon was a story about country boys' first time at court gone horribly wrong. Reinhold is the oldest of the 4 sons of Aemon. They have a magical horse, Bayard. Bayard is a huge deal. Like, Bayard is a magical horse that can change size to hold 4 riders. That's his thing. And he has supernatural vitality and he can run forever. But, it's not that cool of a superpower, but Bayard in France is, like, whoa. Like, Bayard is the model after every other magical horse was drawn. He was the prototype of the magical horse. So they go to court. Roland wins the tournament. He is playing chess with other members of court, and Charlemagne's shitty nephew or son, it's undetermined, because it happens both ways, plays chess and loses, and he says, "You must have cheated," and he smacks him across the face and beats him across the head with the chessboard. And Reinhold is a belted knight, and no blow can go unchallenged after that, draws his sword and splits his head open. And that's the prince. So Charlemagne, in the mode of the tyrant, is vengeful, and then chases after them. They go back to their home in the Ardennes. Their home is burned down by Charlemagne. They flee to the south. They find the fortress, or a fortress is magically raised for them by his spell sword cousin, because that's Smogris. The fortress of Montauban. And in the original legend, Charlemagne goes and he razes the castle, and eventually they plead for clemency, and Roland comes and he's like, it would be a shame to kill such brave knights who've fought so well for so long. And in the original legend, Charlemagne's like, fine, I'm still burning this castle down. You have to give me the horse. We're going to put a millstone around its nest, cast it into a river and drown it, and you all are going to go on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And they do, and they die in the Holy Land, redeeming themselves for their transgression of rebelling against the crown, and that's the end. But medieval people are like, that can't be the end. They're too cool. It's gotta be something else, and so they retcon it.
Because it's DC.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's DC. These are characters, and they're like, it's that can't be the end. And so instead, what actually happened is that Roland pleads with Charlemagne to spare the lives of these brave knights, and says, hey, they're already in the Pyrenees. They can be a bulwark against the Saracens because they've got this fortress here, and any other knight who isn't fitting well in society will just send them there, and they can be our first line of defense against the Muslims because we don't really care about them now, okay? So, now Reinhold is in this this outlaw fortress, and they're renegades defending the realm against Muslim predation. Right? So, yeah, instead of, they went to the Holy Land and they died. Now they're renegades, and he's got this band of desperate men living on the edge, and it's cool. And medieval people thought it was cool. And then he became a stock character himself, and he was usually just Reinhold, dragged along in a bunch of adventures with Roland, because he's cooler than Oliver, because he doesn't die at the end. So, Naaman, we've talked about him. He's very much Nestor. Holger Danske was, oh my gosh, we've got to talk about it. Ogier the Dane is the character that you will often see. Holger Danske is Ogier the Dane in Danish. But what this man's name probably was Odgir. Odgir, which was Latinized to be Othgirius. But if you just imagine saying Odgir in French with a French accent, it doesn't work. Odgir does not work. So they dropped the D. Ogier. Now, try saying Ogier with a Swedish accent. So, Holger, the person Oddgeir would have been perfectly pronounceable with a Swedish accent, but it went around because he became Oddgeir, and then the legend went back to Scandinavia, and they can't say Oddgeir, but they've forgotten Othgirius. They can't say Ogier, but they've forgotten Othgirius, and so so it became Holger. Holger Danske became the king under the mountain in legend for some reason. I don't know. I can't figure out how that happened. But anyway, he was one of Charlemagne's early friends and enforcers. Maugris is Reinhold's cousin, who was raised by the fairy lady Oriond and became a sorcerer while also being a Belgian Christian knight. He may have tamed Bayard the magical horse. He may have found or created Flamberge, Roland's magical blade, because Roland can't be without a magical blade if Reinhold, Reinhold can't be without a magical blade because Roland has one. So Flamberge, which initially may have meant like blade that cuts really good, but turned it into Flamberge flame blade. So yeah, a blade that ignites itself. It's a lightsaber. It's a lightsaber. Also may have erected Montauban overnight. Montauban did not exist, but exists now because the people in the Middle Ages were fanboys of cool stuff, just like we are fanboys of cool stuff. So Montauban really means Mount Roman. Alban is Alban. The Alban Hills are the hills around Rome. So like Julius Caesar was an Alban, Gracchus was an Alban. So saying Montauban literally means Mount Roman. So it was probably a Roman hill fort, if it ever actually existed. But, so there was no place... Oh, okay. If somebody's ready to teach, I'll just go away. But, yeah. So, yeah, so that's who that was. Who's left? Bradamante. Oh, Bradamante is supposedly Reinhold's sister. Was not in any of the original myths. Was developed for a romantic adventure in the 16th century. What? No, I don't. So yeah, it was developed as Bradamante is like, oh, there's a female knight in legend. Like, well, sort of.
French for Mary Sue.
Bradamante literally means wild lover. Yeah, so she was developed as a female knightly character to entice the best Muslim knight to becoming Christian through their love. Like that was, my gosh, that was the conversion is such a huge part of Carolingian legend. You were expected in chivalric culture if like you are to be an enemy to all pagans, but if they say I wish to convert, then hostilities cease. You are expected as a knight to get down off your horse, take off your helmet, find water, baptize them then and there in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, then take them to a church and get them catechized, and they are now your brother. It is supposed to be that immediate. Like you are supposed to at one point they are enemies, then they wish to convert, now they are brothers. You baptize them immediately, and then take them and integrate them in Christian society. And you see that over and over in the legends. But whether I think that was probably aspirational. I think that was, life never works out that cleanly. But literature can. And so that was the aspiration that they held themselves to. That well, it's supposed to be like this. Maybe it's not like this, but it's supposed to be. Much like superhero literature is not how the world really works, but we wish it did. Sometimes. Sometimes not. But sometimes we wish that was how it worked. So, yes.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating.
Thank you for attending. Thank you for braving the rain.